Bom, acho que não tínhamos aqui, até aqui na Fundação Instituto Fernando Henrique Cardoso, uma exposição tão abrangente sobre o tema. Mais uma razão para te agradecer. Ainda no capítulo dos agradecimentos, antes de eu abrir para perguntas, eu queria agradecer os patrocinadores da nossa série de seminários em 2014. Eu vou nomeá-los individualmente: a BMF Bovespa, o Santander, a CPFL, a Telefônica Vivo, a IBM, a Votorantim, a Croton, o apoio também da Band News, que deve estar filmando aqui. Nesse caso, contamos também com o apoio do CEBEDS. E queria acrescentar a esse agradecimento um agradecimento ao Deutsche Bank na pessoa do Bernardo Planes, porque sem, enfim, a ajuda de vocês, inclusive operacional, agradecer a tua equipe aí, que foi, enfim, extremamente simpática e eficiente, o evento de hoje não teria acontecido. Então, nosso muito obrigado. Então, dito isso, eu queria abrir para as perguntas, como de praxe. As perguntas podem ser feitas em português, o Caio fala português tão bem ou melhor do que nós. E o Arno pode fazer em alemão também, porque fala perfeitamente.
Chinês.
Chinês, acho que ele ainda não fala. Então vamos recolher umas 3 perguntas, volta à mesa e a gente faz algumas rodadas sucessivas até um limite razoável de tempo e de energia aqui do nosso convidado. Peço que as pessoas se identifiquem antes de fazer a pergunta.
Bom dia, parabéns pela explanação. Eu sou Marcos Peçanha, da CESP. Para manter a pergunta de 2 perguntas concisas. A primeira é: qual é o espaço para hidroenergia no mundo? Que você não mencionou. E a segunda, aqui no Brasil, qual é o papel que os biocombustíveis, apesar de você ter conversado sobre agricultura, qual é o papel que os biocombustíveis, em especial cana-de-açúcar, com o bagaço de cana e com etanol, pode ter na composição desse mix da matriz energética?
Muito bom. Duas perguntas, mas ambas concisas. O Arno aqui do lado, aqui, ele vai falar em alemão?
Não. Vou aproveitar que o Caio falou português, então é mais fácil. Né? Caio, eu queria saber de você como você vê o futuro da energia nuclear. Né? Você falou que a Alemanha tomou uma decisão, depois do desastre lá no Japão, de acabar com a energia nuclear até 2022, né? Se eu entendi bem. Outros países, não, mesmo dentro da comunidade europeia, outros países não têm essa visão. Né? A França manteve o seu programa de energia nuclear. Isso, e China tem um grande programa de energia nuclear. Como é que você vê o futuro da energia nuclear no mundo? Você acha que a Alemanha é o futuro ou a China outros países representam o futuro?
Podemos recolher mais uma pergunta?
A minha é simples. Os transportes são responsáveis não só por um grande consumo de energia, mas para a poluição. E aí já temos um aliado, a Organização Mundial de Saúde, provou por pesquisa que a poluição nas cidades ela é um dos fatores causadores da incidência maior de câncer. Então, eu queria saber do ilustre palestrante qual é o cenário, eu chamo de longo prazo, para o carro particular e movido a que tipo de energia. Ou então, se vai predominar o sonho dos sonhadores, que gostam de sonhar, e não vai ter carro particular no futuro, só transporte coletivo.
Muito bom. Caio, a palavra é tua.
Well, these are all very major areas, so I can only begin on that. And on hydro, obviously, the more can come from hydro, but I come with my but in a moment, the better. And of course, Brazil is, in the sense of 75% renewable already, largely because of your hydro. But number one, I would warn that one has to be very careful in a systemic sense. Take the big schemes in China, for example. I was familiar with already in the 80s when they came to the World Bank for Three Gorges, of what the collateral impact is in terms of agriculture, in terms of weather, climate, and all the rest. And there are, of course, hydro which are no-brainers, let me mention in Europe, I'm dreaming of, and it's not in a dream, it's being worked on, a European energy market where hydro in Scandinavia, and some other countries, would play a major role even for storage. I mentioned the variability of renewables. You could have as intelligent grids and the new technology of high voltage direct current transmission, which Brazil, China, others are also pioneering, easily have a European net where you have wind in Scotland, you have hydro in Scandinavia, you have solar in the Mediterranean, and you connect this in a smart grid. So that is a no-brainer. I mean, and there are many other parts of the world where this can be developed. But I'm afraid we will have to realize that the potential is not unlimited, and I know you know better than I do how controversial even in Brazil, some of the power station dams in the Amazon, etc. So yes, it has to figure in the mix, but don't expect the magic bullet from hydro development. And I worry, let me aside on water, I'm very worried that the next mega or big crisis around the world is a water crisis, even leading to border disputes and things like that. When you see what happens in Asia, when you see our water tables are dropping in most parts of the world, look even at California and the western United States, yes, there is enormous scope for water efficiency and use. And again, if you're now dreaming for a moment, maybe in the long run, you could combine two unlimited supplies. One is solar power for desalination, and the other one is to use saltwater, seawater, in unlimited, but we're still far away from that from a cost and other angles. So limited scope, yes, for Brazil obviously major, but not easy to get the magic triangle between land use, water and energy right, because you can easily, if you maximize one, have major impact on the other two, and obviously climate in all of that. Biocombustibles. Well, I would like to learn from you. I mean, I'm not, because you addressed it particularly to Brazil. In the US, what they did on the basis of maize or corn, of course, didn't make any sense. And farmers are now already realizing that this will probably not continue. It's enormously, the transformation rates, I mean, the efficiency of that, of course, are only 1/7 of sugarcane good conditions in Brazil. So that one doesn't make any sense. And in fact, also, we came to a conclusion for Europe because there's a lot of wood chips now being used. It's at the moment actually quite advantageous, but when you think it through on a massive scale, it's probably not a big part of the solution. Now in Brazil, you really have to tell me, I don't know what's going on in terms of, on the one hand, subsidizing now through Petrobras, using the enormous capital increase for subsidies, doesn't seem to make much sense for me. It obviously, the ethanol industry is worried. What is the right mix here? I want to be a bit agnostic and listen to others.
I suspect you know the answer.
That's here. Nuclear. And here I might have a disagreement with my wife, so so it's dangerous what I'm saying.
You can quarrel over it.
I accept that nuclear waste, no solution yet. I mean, we have to think about that. I mean, this will be thousands or hundreds of years. I mean, Maita would give all the arguments. So there is a huge risk, big risk, uncertainty here. It actually reminds me a bit of CCS. You know, we all talked years ago about on coal, to continue use of coal, but have carbon capture and storage systems, which of course there are some pilots now, Norway, etc. But frankly, the more I learn about it, how expensive it is, and frankly, again, it's the S here. It's not the capture, it's the storage. Where you put all this CO2? It's under the North Sea and here and there. If you scale this up massively, I think there are a lot of problems in both nuclear and CCS of that nature. I think my personal view is Germany was not wise. I don't know why Angela Merkel did it, to accelerate the exit to 2022, because the formula before was 2032. Of course, it's also arguable that it should be 32. But I think when you look at what I described here as the energy map for Germany, and we'll come to Europe in a moment, it is feasible without nuclear, but it's extremely ambitious to do that by 2022, given all the other dimensions. Is nuclear the answer for the future? I remain a bit agnostic. I was in Japan and talked to many post-Fukushima people there. They, of course, the new government, Abe, want to go back to maybe 30% nuclear. They had banked on much more, up to 50 in the past. The previous government was thinking they might come all the way down to 15. But again, in Japan, you know, no single one has been reactivated because the shock is so deep and local protests are so strong. I wish them good luck on this small island to go to 30% nuclear, given the behavior and the attitudes and the risk aversion of a population that obviously has very tragically been hit by what happened. China was mentioned. I think China is working on fourth generation nuclear. There is probably a lot of innovation eventually coming. I understand, I'm not an expert. This is also safer, more economic, etc. And of course, they see the way out of coal not only through the other things, but also through nuclear. But even in China, they told me it's a big issue now where you put these things. In the densely populated coastal areas where you have the demand, nobody wants it. I mean, Fukushima revisited in China, and I don't know what your policy will be in Brazil. So I worry about the unresolved issues, and again, I would not bank on nuclear all the way out. Back to Europe, France 75% nuclear. Even Hollande, and we are working with them through the European Climate Foundation, where I'm chairman, is they want to bring that down. They think simply from all I talked about, private sector, risk optimization, holistic view of risk, they think that's clearly too high. Now, they of course believe, particularly their companies, in nuclear, but I wouldn't be surprised if they bring this back and then bring this into a European context. UK, to some extent, I mean, are waking up now reality where they don't have the means to meet their targets. They just signed with a Chinese company and the French. So I think it's a very mixed blessing, to put it diplomatically, and not the answer for all this. Transports, of course. I don't think there will be exit of or a goodbye to individual transport. But look what Singapore, always leading in many areas, just announced these days. And I think Mawani, one of the think tank leaders there, is absolutely right. Why not make Singapore an electric vehicle-only experiment? They can do it. They have the money and the means and the policies, and demonstrate what this means for urban transport, for ways of living. I mean, the whole thing here. My answer is electric vehicles, and not just hybrids, but really electric vehicles. I think battery technology is advancing very fast when you now have a distance of, say, 160 kilometers, some more, to travel. This will go up. Costs will come down. I think you can intelligently use cars also as energy storage. I was just talking to an American yesterday in California who has one of these new fancy Teslas. They're still very expensive. And he says he gets that electricity into the system at night. He doesn't drive very far in Silicon Valley to work. So during the day, he sells it at a higher price out of his battery, part of it, what he doesn't need because his use is predictable. So there are serious schemes now considering how electric vehicles, transport, can also be, to some extent, a storage. So I would go for, and of course for the traditional combustion engine, you can be much more effective. These days, what's in the German press will be support, because Germany produces all the fancy heavy cars, 95 grams rule of the EU. I think it will come. Might take a bit longer. But just imagine how this has come down from more than 200, more 195, and even then Mercedes, BMW, Porsche, and subscribing to that. I think technologies has not reached its limits there, but obviously it should also make a rethink in Germany, the car industry, whether you really want to have these huge cars or whether it might not be better to have very fancy, high-cost, luxurious small cars do job. But I agree that urban transport is but you have to link it back to urbanization. When the Chinese now say that it was a big mistake, in a sense, the way they urbanized the American way, all in the last 30 years, actually, and how to do it differently. I would expect we had a very good speech at the forum there in China of the mayor of Shanghai, who depicted how future urbanization will happen, not just add to these big cities, but medium-sized cities, but also in the big cities, to have fingers of urbanization, so you have green and others in between. Tell you a little story. I mean, at that lunch in China, international audience, this mayor of Shanghai, an expert now in this area, head of the engineering society or whatever, he showed a slide where he showed that in 1985, the traffic in the entire intermodal traffic in Beijing was still 62% bicycle. 62% bicycles. You know what happened since then. And then he showed a few slides later a slide depicting how they're desperately trying to find areas now in Beijing for bicycle paths. The irony didn't escape the audience. There was laughter. I mean, this is only 30 years where they could have gone in a different way. And now they're looking for returning, like many of us do, for near-term neighborhood traffic, but finding desperately bicycle paths. When I came to China first in 1980, of course, you saw only bicycles around. So there's more to be done there.
Why not to use as in other public service? Pay for the use of the
Yes.
road.
Off the
then
road.
You can use the pricing system
Sure.
without any authority, how do I say, discriminatory
Yes.
decision of the government, which it really doesn't put
Yeah.
in charge. You have ways in electronic.
Well, of course, London, others are trying it for congestion reasons, this principle.
Professional reasons, but not only for that.
No.
To keep the cars paying for, as you do for other public services like water, telephone, electricity. You
But-
pay for not only for the running costs, but you pay also for the investment costs.
Yes.
Car driving, and here in Brazil it creates a very serious problem because of nossa matriz, desculpe ele falar
Não, pai.
inglês, eu estou falando inglês, um esforço. A nossa matriz de transportes, ela está apoiada em 90% no caminhão. E o caminhão não quer pagar pedágio, não quer pagar pela infraestrutura. E os nossos amigos da soja, que vão lá para a Amazônia, eles querem estrada indo até lá de graça, com a infraestrutura valorizando suas propriedades, porque eles não conseguem trazer a soja daquela distância até o porto. Então, nós estamos com um mercado de transporte completamente desestruturado, porque a parte do transporte rodoviário não está pagando pelo uso da infraestrutura. Aí vão aos Estados Unidos e vão à Europa, diz que lá não se cobra. Não, é um minutinho só, porque eu acho que isso eu guardei, está preso aqui. Porque a Europa tem 40 mil dólares per capita, nós temos 10 mil. Se ela pode se dar o luxo, como nos Estados Unidos, de não cobrar pela infraestrutura das cidades e ter infraestrutura para poder atender a demanda, nós não temos. É só isso. Obrigado.
Look,
Desculpe,
of course, the answer would be, I talked extensively about the carbon price. I mean, let's price these things correctly and price also road usage, let the market do it. I found a very interesting statistic recently, how attitudes towards cars, individual cars, is changing with the young generation. And this comes from the US, where you wouldn't expect it, or expected the least. I mean, obviously cars have been for our generation status symbols. In fact, what Singapore is making the case, if you go to electrify Singapore, it's not more the Lamborghinis or Maseratis, it would be these electric vehicles. I'm sure there will be some fancier, less fancy ones. It would go against this trend of seeing the car not just a means of transport, but as a status symbol. But what I find interesting, this American statistics, is they call it the millennials, the generation born after 86. And well, very different from the baby boomers. Because they want to move back into inner cities. Look at what's fortunately happening there now. They don't believe in cars. For them, the expression of freedom or status is the iPhone, the smartphone, is those devices, not whether they have a big car or racing car or not. And now comes the number. I mean, I don't have the exact number in mind, but it's a very sizable decrease of miles traveled per person of these millennials vis-a-vis their father. Amazing difference. I think it's a 25% reduction over the last 10 years. So these attitudes are changing. And once this becomes fashionable, I think then you can do all kinds of things. But for America to say goodbye to the car in this next generation, I mean, my son lives in America, works in Washington. He doesn't want to have a car. If he needs one of his friends, he rents it the weekend. Couldn't care less. But they all go back in the cities. It's a totally different thing. And we didn't talk in the whole presentation about behavioral change. You know, and all this, what in the numbers I mentioned, what is not factored in is, even if it's only a modicum, whether it's food, what you eat, how you drive, and that, of course, should eventually be a big part of the solution.
Muito bem. Quer dizer, acabou a época do papai me empresta um carro. E Daniela, não é? Aqui, depois Ricardo lá no fundo, e tem ali na minha ponta direita, assim, três perguntas.
Bom dia. É Daniela Chiaretti, do Valor Econômico. Eu teria várias perguntas para fazer com o senhor, mas vou tentar fazer duas. O senhor mencionou rapidamente no final...
Tá ligado, Daniela? Acho que está desligado.
O senhor mencionou rapidamente no final o colapso do mercado de carbono europeu e isso sendo redesenhado. Gostaria que se o senhor pudesse elaborar um pouco mais sobre isso. E também, na sua palestra, o senhor falou sobre o aumento, o número de pessoas de classe média que estarão nos próximos anos, né? Impressionante.
Próximas décadas,
E o senhor disse, por exemplo, mencionou só que se os chineses quiserem consumir tanta carne quanto os americanos, o problema que isso vai ser. Como é que o senhor imagina que essa questão do consumo das classes emergentes e de classe média no mundo, na China, no Brasil, na África do Sul e nos outros países, querendo consumir mais, como é que o senhor imagina que isso pode ser, de alguma maneira, iniciado a equacionar, né? De alguma forma?
Legal. Ricardo ali atrás.
Meu nome é Ricardo Carvalho, sou jornalista, trabalho já há algum tempo nessa área de meio ambiente e sustentabilidade. E me preocupa muito essa crise climática, porque está clara que, não só apenas na sua palestra, na intervenção que me precedeu, de que envolve muito mais coisas do que uma simples negociação de carbono. Significa mudança de hábitos no nosso cotidiano, significa repensar o caminho que a humanidade tem que traçar. E eu me pergunto, em relação ao petróleo, há algum estudo que se consegue enxergar por mais quanto tempo a humanidade vai precisar de petróleo? Porque tudo me parece quase que ações de marketing. O carro elétrico aqui, uma tentativa ali, e a crise climática vai aumentando cada vez mais. Os números são alarmantes. E uma pergunta que não é pessimista, tenta ser realista, será que vai dar tempo ou será que a humanidade precisa ter uma catástrofe para aprender a lidar com a mudança do clima?
Meu nome é Cristina Catunda, eu sou da iFHC. Eu queria saber a opinião do senhor sobre o segundo período de negociação do Protocolo de Quioto, principalmente em relação ao posicionamento dos principais emissores, se o Acordo de Copenhague ainda vai ser levado em consideração nessa negociação, e a questão do financiamento para adaptação com foco nas populações mais vulneráveis.
Só pergunta simples.
Até hoje à noite?
Até hoje.
Não, boas perguntas. First on the European ETS. It's very complicated, but very simply put, you have to make the ETS, the emissions trading system, a real market, which it is not. Because you don't manage both demand and supply. And what I have as a model is, of course, the way central banks manage foreign exchange markets, currency markets. You have to be able to come in, you have to sell, you have to buy, and you need to professionalize these markets. It's still done a bit too much by, I would say, the bureaucrats, the makers. It's slow, it's not very professional. Deutsche Bank has put forward, in doing this revisiting of the ETS, quite a number of proposals, very practical proposals, how you manage. So what is now proposed by the Commission, which is basically backloading the emission rights so that you create scarcity, is a backstop, is a fix for now, but you really have to revisit the whole system, and it can be done. I mean, it was at 25 at some point. It's now at very low, 5, 6, 7 euros price. So I would expect, and it's very complicated because we have a European emissions market. We talked before, a European energy market. And whether things like that you can buy the emission rights through the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism in developing countries, not too sure. I think there's been a lot of leakage, actually, there, if one is honest, of what was done with that. I think it was good to get this going, put the right incentives. Chinese were among the main beneficiaries, and many projects in China are very good here. But I think whether this really resulted in net reduction in emissions, it didn't replace some other measures that would have taken anyway. So a host of issues. But the fundamental thing is professionalize the market, make it a real market where you manage supply and demand, and give, for God's sake, what we like to call investment community TLC, transparency, longevity, and credibility to these policies. Doesn't make any sense to, every time there's a problem, fiddle with the parameters like Spain did on the feed-in tariff regimes retroactively. That's devastating, obviously, for what are basically still policy-driven markets. I said the ambition has to be, I'm talking now renewables, that we will be fully competitive with renewables. And it will be onshore wind and PV solar. It will not be offshore wind. That's too expensive. It will not probably be the biocarbon, I mean bioenergy. They will not be competitive, but these other two will be. So make a real market of it. Secondly, on that's the $1,000 million question, middle-class consumption patterns. I mean, obviously, right. I think in the end it has to be a combination of generational change. I talked about attitudes towards cars. It has to be the health concerns. It has to be what's the fashion, what's the model, who is leading this that will make a difference. I think fundamentally it's of course education, but that's of course a generational and more proposition. If you really start in schools, even in America now, the young generation, the school kids, learn very different things about that than their Tea Party parents who oppose everything in this. But I don't claim to have the full answer. On oil consumption, petroleum consumption, very hard to say. If you do what I suggested gradually, phase out these 500 billion plus in fossil fuel subsidies, one big step. Technology, we talked many areas, another big step, energy efficiency. If you then price the externality, the carbon price, I think you will see a very different pattern of growth of oil consumption, but I'm not naive enough to believe that spells the end of the hydrocarbon world. And there comes in then things like clean coal. I think it's much more important actually to make sure we get off coal. That's the first target. International coal campaigns, we are funding some through the European Climate Foundation, are quite effective. I mean, not even in the US, mainly because of shale gas, but also because of people suing every new project. What is it called? This Client Earth is a foundation that whenever a coal plant is being proposed, they immediately go to the courts litigation, the other way around, and they stop most of it. So coal is the first one. Gas, I talked about the bridging technology here. And ultimately, I think is for markets to take a long-term view, I called it ESG, of what might become stranded assets. At the moment, it's coal already, it's priced in. in many countries. It should be in the long run also tar sands and some of the petroleum areas. And obviously, the earlier these new technologies are introduced in the big future oil consumers like India and China, the better. But it's not the end of the fossil fuel centuries yet.
There is another question about the negotiations in
Oh yeah,
Copenhagen.
the negotiations. Ha. I don't want to sound too pessimistic. Fabio knows my views. Although I come from I worked 25 years for the World Bank, so I'm really truly a multilateralist. But I'm despair with the UN. I think the UN has almost now a class where it's countries or negotiators that are not necessarily interested in the final result, but only in the process. If you want to be really, but this is pretty not for, please not for probably quotation. You could, and I quote somebody else by saying that. The UN reminds of not a truck that breaks down on the way to where we all want to go, pulls aside, and then other trucks make the road. But it's an overturned truck in the middle of the highway, not allowing anybody else to get around it. I mean, in other words, it is only the UNFCCC process, it can only be the UN process. I wish President Hollande good luck, but I think the likelihood that we have a unsatisfactory outcome in 2015 at the COP, unfortunately, is very high, and that's why I try to point to many areas where we can move the needle without relying on this agreement. And of course, there is a bit, some would question whether the answer is really, in the end, to apportion, in a sense, emission rights and all the rest. You get immediately always into history, who caused the problem, who will cause it in the future, and whether more intelligent solutions like carbon taxes, cap and trade, technologies, I mean a whole set of things. However, in the end, this has to add up to the 2 degrees Celsius limit of global warming, and more equally worrisome the variability in weather patterns. And there I'm still question that, because it might not give you thing. But if you complement the top down and the bottom up, it might. Let's try. Let's see what the leaders say next year in September, and what will happen in 2015. But you know what we have, I mean, it's more philosophical. I think in international negotiations, or generally in global governance, I mentioned at the outset, the weakness of global joint action. We have erred on the side of legitimacy rather than effectiveness of international governance. 190 countries in the room is the UN principle, great. And eventually, of course, all countries should have their say and agree. But it's not to spur innovation and to come to a solution. I was involved in creating the G20 when the G7 had outlived its usefulness. Brazil loved it, China loved it, etc. You need countries that are more limited size and can manage like any company would do, but who do accept, on the other hand, that with systemic significance, which makes them part of this club, comes systemic responsibility. So Brazil should also think, when it's in the G20, about other countries in Latin America, Mexico, and so on, and the US, etc. But we have to form other ways of governing, and the UN is the extreme of legitimacy versus efficacy in the way. I think the world will find, I think Pascal Lamy, whom I admire a lot, just came out, I haven't read it yet, but I saw it in the papers, with the Oxford study on future governance. And he even goes further. He has ideas such as, which I like very much, it's a bit my alliances theme, that on climate, you might want to put in charge 20 countries, 30 cities, and 40 companies to think through how you develop strategy. A very different approach, and it could translate into other areas, because boardrooms are often ahead of cabinet rooms. Politics are so hampered, as we all know, by re-election, by the short term. Frankly, I think our political class is completely failing us on the mega trends, and we only discussed climate here this morning. Look at all the other things, migration and security and so on. And the tragedy is actually that with all the potential, and all the multipolarity that we now have in the world, and that's very good. It's not one superpower, it's a multipolar world. We are becoming more multipolar and less multilateral. And by that I mean less able to deal in a multilateral way with the multipolarity. That's tragic. I mean, more multipolar, less multilateral. Who breaks that? I don't know. In the end, it comes all bound to leadership.
UN is not a non-government organization. It should be called an international government organization.
The UN.
No, UN is known as a non-government organization. It's not true. The only people who goes there are the government from the various
That's
countries.
right.
It's an international government organization.
That's right.
And here in Brazil, we have a cousin of the UN, which is our Congress.
Com esse comentário a gente encerra amanhã. Caio, muito obrigado. Ótima palestra, ótima conversa e até a próxima.